Welcome back, vintage technology lovers. It's Gordon here, and in this episode of Dinobytes I'm going to be taking a look back at the Canon PowerShot Pro90 EIS, which when it was launched in 2001 represented the top of the PowerShot series, the flagship model, and it carried a price tag to match, around $1,300 or £1,100. Now, the Pro90 EIS was based on the innards of the PowerShot G1, which launched a year earlier in the year 2000, but swapped that meager 3x optical zoom for a 10x optical range. And it was Canon's first digital camera with a 10x optical zoom with image stabilization. So 20 years on, let's see how it compares. The distinctive L-shaped design of the Pro90 EIS is obviously inspired by DSLRs or SLRs with zoom lenses, but in fact it built upon the earlier Canon PowerShot Pro90, one of their very first digital cameras launched in 1998. That model only had a 2.5x zoom, it wasn't image stabilized, and it also only had 1.7 megapixels, but the Pro90 EIS built on that design and improved it in every respect. For starters, the Pro90 EIS inherited the full manual control of the PowerShot G1. So looking at that mode dial from the left-hand side, pretty much lifted from our earlier model, you've got full PASM modes along with creative presets. Set it to manual and you've got access to shutter speeds from 8 seconds to 1,000th of a second. And in aperture priority or manual mode, you've got control over that aperture too. But due to a single diaphragm operating both the shutter and the aperture, you can't have the maximum shutter and the aperture at the same time. So it's either 1,000th of a second at f4 or 800th of a second at the maximum aperture of f2.8. On the top of the camera you'll find a hot shoe, again inherited from the G1, and allowing the Pro90 EIS to use Canon's speedlight flash guns. And meanwhile, on the top of the grip you'll also see there's a detailed display, again inherited from the G1, and providing a wealth of information at a glance. Now, of course, what really set the Pro90 EIS apart from the G1 and most other digital cameras at the time was that 10x optical zoom range, equivalent to 37 to 370 millimeters. So that takes you from here all the way to here. And it's a motorized zoom that uses a twistable ring at the end of the barrel to operate. And you can even see when it's fully zoomed in that image stabilization, allowing me to hold it very steady. Now, while optical viewfinders are absolutely fine for zoom ranges of around 3 to 4 times, once you get to 10 times they become impractical. So the Pro90 EIS departed from the G1's main form of composition and instead switched to an electronic viewfinder, which you can see here on the back of the camera. Now, unsurprisingly, for a panel that's 20 years old, there's not a lot of detail and the image is also very small compared to modern electronic viewfinders, but it did allow you to compose fairly comfortably and accurately, which is the important thing. In terms of a screen though, the Pro90 EIS simply inherited what Canon fitted onto the G1 a year before. So this camera gets itself a fully articulated side hinge screen that can twist all the way to face forward, which is great news if you're into selfies or vlogging, and if you're really lucky I might show you an example of that later on. The panel's the same size as the G1 as well, 1.8 inch, which is pretty small compared to today's cameras, but par for the course 20 years ago. In terms of battery, the Pro90 EIS was powered by Canon's BP511. Now, this was one of the first models to use this battery pack, and it is of course a proprietary lithium-ion battery, which usually spells trouble when you're trying to power up these cameras 20 years later. However, Canon went on to use this battery in many different cameras, most notably a whole series of semi-professional DSLRs, including the 40D and the 5D, and it also succeeded it with the BP511A, and all of those packs are backwards and forwards compatible. Now, while Canon may not have used the BP511 in a new camera since around 2008, it still remains readily available. So you can buy a brand new BP511A today and pop it inside the Pro90 EIS and power it up quite happily. And because this is quite a hefty battery pack, you'll get tons of life out of it. It's also good news on the memory card front. The Pro90 EIS uses compact flash cards, which again are still available today and easily readable as well. Now, Canon's slot here supports Type 1 and Type 2 CF cards, so it will work with the IBM microdrive, which supported capacities up to 1 gigabyte. And back in 2001, that was an absolutely enormous amount of storage. However, today I quite happily used it with a solid state card. This is my SanDisk 1 gigabyte Ultra card, and that worked absolutely fine on the Pro90 EIS, and I managed to get about 1,000 pictures onto this memory card. As for connectivity, the Pro90 EIS has a proprietary serial port Canon supplied the camera with a cable that actually had a USB interface on the other side. However, it did need a Twain driver in order to acquire those images out of the camera. But again, you can easily just remove the CF card and pop them into a card reader. There's also a composite video output and a DC input if you want to charge the battery inside the camera, but the BP511 works perfectly well with external AC chargers. Okay, I've kept you in suspense long enough. On to resolution and image quality. Right, the PowerShot Pro90 IS was equipped with a 1/1.8 inch CCD sensor with about 3.3 megapixels. So in that respect, pretty much the same as the G1 the year before. However, due to that 10 times optical zoom lens, the imaging circle couldn't quite cover the entire sensor, so Canon had to crop the images down to an effective resolution of 2.6 megapixels. Now, in practice, this didn't actually make much difference. When I reviewed it back in 2001, the image quality looked very similar to models with 3 megapixels or a little bit more. And it wasn't the only camera that had to do this. Sony's DSC f505V also had to crop the images from a 3 megapixel sensor to 2.6 megapixel resolution. In terms of sensitivity, the sensor ran between 50 and 400 ISO, although if you set it to auto ISO, it only went between 50 and 100, so not a great scale there. And best quality JPEGs measured just under 1 megabyte each, about 800K. So again, if you managed to get a 1 gigabyte card in there, you'd be looking at about 1,000 images. The camera also could record RAW files. Right, that's enough talk. Let's actually take a look at a bunch of images that are photographed with the Pro90 IS 20 years after its launch. The Pro90 IS wasn't just about taking photos, it could film video as well. You're looking at an example of it right now in glorious quarter VGA or 320 by 240 pixels at a rather jerky 15 frames per second. But since the movie mode would record audio, you could flip the screen forward to face you, and the lens had stabilization, you could kind of film a vlog with it, and a mercifully short one too because the clips were limited to 30 seconds. Right, let's take a look at some other video examples. As my wander down to Brighton Beach comes to an end, so does my story of the Pro90 IS. When Canon launched the camera in 2001, its two biggest rivals arguably came from the year before, Sony's f505V with a 5 times optical zoom, or the Olympus C2100 Ultra Zoom with a 10 times range. And a year later, when Canon launched the Pro90 IS, both of those companies were able to undercut it a little on price. Canon followed up the Pro90 IS with the PowerShot Pro 1 in 2004, with an 8 megapixel sensor and a 7.1 times optical zoom, most notably sporting a red ring denoting L quality. Indeed, it was one of the few non-interchangeable lenses from Canon to sport that L classification. And that was the end of the PowerShot Pro series. Just 3 models, starting with the Pro90, ending with the Pro1 and with the Pro90 IS sandwiched in the middle. Canon, of course, didn't give up with super zooms in the mid-2000s. It continued with the SX series, which was enormously popular, albeit with a slightly more traditional mini DSLR-like form factor. As for the Pro90 IS, well, today this really feels like the camera that had it all. It was launched at a time when Canon packed literally everything it could think of into a camera. It had a 10 times optical zoom with optical stabilization, which was unusual at the time, a fully articulated screen that faced forward, an electronic viewfinder, top information screen, very powerful battery, and access to some of the largest storage options that were around at the time. And it's for all of these reasons that each of those 3 PowerShot Pro models deserves their place in the Classic Camera Hall of Fame. And that's it for this trip down memory lane, along with hopefully a very pleasant trip down to Brighton seafront. See, you really do get sunny blue skies in England, at least sometimes. So as always, tell me what your first digital camera experience was. Did you have one of the PowerShot Pro models? Do you miss those days when Canon would pack everything it could think of into a digital camera? And most importantly, if you're enjoying these videos, please do show your support by subscribing. It really does help this small channel grow. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.